The jury find the defendant, Jackson Paul Vogel, as to the count of first-degree intentional homicide as charged in the information, guilty.
Well, as you just saw, a jury in Brown County convicting GBCI inmate Jackson Vogel of killing cellmate Michael Laureano in August of last year.
It only took about 25 minutes for the jury to reach that verdict following this morning's closing arguments. Drew Best bringing us more on today's court proceedings and the civil action that's yet to play out in this First Alert update. Drew.
Cammie, on the third day of Jackson Vogel's homicide trial, the jury ruled beyond a reasonable doubt that Vogel not only wanted to kill Michael Laureano, but also that he had targeted his then cellmate because of his race and sexual orientation. Throughout the trial, both the prosecution and defense never questioned whether Vogel killed Laureano. Instead, they argued whether Vogel intended to kill Laureano and if he would receive additional penalty for a hate crime. During closing arguments, the defense asked the jury to keep their minds open to a lesser charge of first-degree reckless homicide.
Mr. Vogel testified that he did not mean to kill Mr. Laureano that evening. He testified that he strangled Mr. Laureano until he stopped moving.
The prosecution maintained Vogel had full intent to kill Laureano, citing physical evidence observed throughout the trial and inconsistencies in Vogel's testimony.
The defendant knows his life's on the line. I don't need to use language like that, but obviously he now knows he's on trial. He knows he's charged with crimes. He knows he's charged with a hate crime. Now the story changes. That is not a coincidence. That is not him now talking about what the truth is.
As Vogel now awaits sentencing, a civil lawsuit filed by Micah's mother in February continues to move through the federal system. A summons issued to both GBCI's warden and the Secretary of Wisconsin's Department of Corrections. The family is asking for a jury trial to determine whether those parties failed to protect Michael Laureano during his time at GBCI. Cammie?